Okay, you got this. You're fast. You're speed. You're lightning. I am speed. Ka-chow! This is the Prusa SL1S, and it's pretty fast. In fact, in most cases, it's faster than every other 3D printer I own, including filament-based ones. This is a resin printer, obviously. It's also the smartest 3D printer I've ever used, to the point where sometimes it's even outsmarting itself. And it is also the most expensive 3D printer setup that I have, coming in at almost 2,000 euros for the printer itself, or 2,500 euros for the bundle with the CW1S curing and washing machine, which you should definitely get if you don't have one already. It's kind of expensive, but it's also kind of good. And it's really, really fast. So let's check it out right after the message from today's sponsor, Seraitech. Seraitech makes a whole lineup of 3D printer resins, ranging from the low-cost Simple over the high-detail build to Blue, which is just simply a balanced resin optimized specifically for LCD resin printers like the SL1S. For this review, I've used Seraitech's Fast Resin, which takes less time to cure for each layer, so if you wanted to push the SL1S's insane printing speeds even further than what it does out of the box with standard resins, Fast would be the ideal candidate for it. Seraitech's resins are available worldwide through resellers on Amazon or directly in Seraitech's store. Check out the links in the description below. Let's start with the disclosure. The original Prusa SL1 was given to me by Prusa free of charge, as was the SL1 upgrade kit. As always, there were no requirements whether, how, or what I should cover about it, and Prusa did not get any influence in this review whatsoever. No money changed hands, as always. So, I've already reviewed the original Prusa SL1 a while ago, but let's get you caught up on what the SL1 and the upgraded SL1S are. First of all, they are resin printers. If you're wondering why there are so many resin printer reviews on this channel at the moment, it's because that's where you're still seeing quite a bit of progress happening versus filament printers, where we haven't really seen all that much improvement over the last couple of years. So the Prusa SL1 and SL1S are both in the compact resin printer class. The SL1S uses a roughly 6-inch masking LCD that gives it a build volume of 127 by 80 by 150 millimeters. This is roughly how large you can print. And for context, this print only took 3.5 hours. That's why it's not just called the SL1S, but the SL1S Speed. So compared to the SL1, it keeps the tilting mechanism, which allows it to peel off even fine details from the FEP film that sits over the masking screen without ripping the print apart. And it also keeps the ball screw-driven Z-axis, the frame, the mainboard, the glorious touchscreen up front, and the smell-absorbing activated carbon filter in the back. But it gets a new monochromatic masking screen, which lets through much more light, and is also warranted for 2,000 hours of use now instead of the 500 hours that you got for the original SL1. And it also gets a new UV curing LED assembly that has heaps more power, and a new custom-designed lens assembly, which means you not only get more light, but also better controlled light curing of parts. And then, because not only the actual curing of the resin takes time, but also the peeling cycle, they made the resin vat lighter by now using a graphite reinforced nylon instead of milling it out of a slab of aluminum, so that the tilting mechanism can work faster without overloading the motor driving it. The result? Pretty much exactly 3 times the print speed from the original SL1. This YouTube-friendly scan of the Lycean Apollo by the Staatsmuseum für Kunst took 9 hours to print on the original SL1, 6 hours on the Mars 3, and just 3 hours on the SL1S, all printed at the normal layer height of 50 microns, making for a total of 2,600 layers. 3 hours is pretty good for this. I also printed one on the Prusa Mark III, and that took 9.5 hours to complete at 100 micron layers, but it was already being throttled by the minimum layer time requirement. The thing is though, the only factor that determines how long a masking LCD printer takes for completing a print at a given layer height is how tall the object is. So I could be printing 10 of these at the same time and it would still take just 3 hours, while a filament printer would start inching into days of printing if you were trying to do the same. It's also the reason why this 75% scale Armel the Polar Paladin only took 3.5 hours of printing on the SL1S. It's pretty fascinating, really. And You can push the SL1S further if you want to. This was all done with the standard 1.8 second layer cure time and the default faster tilt settings. But I'm sure you could still get the tilting action faster and take the curing time way down and still get good parts. These parts all felt really well cured already straight out of the printer. Now, print quality. How does it stack up? Now, obviously, all the resin printers these days have excellent print quality that should be more than sufficient for pretty much everything you could throw at them. But there are still some differences. First of all, there is actually a noticeable but not massive improvement in detail reproduction. It's impossible to spot in actual details, but for example, when it's trying to reproduce that fine-grained texture on the footing, each layer on the SL1S has some more crisp contour details than the somewhat less crispy contours on the SL1. And this is even though the SL1S technically has a lower pixel density than the masking LCD on the SL1. But what is very noticeable is the difference in how shimmery these parts are, which indicates how well the anti-aliasing works. And the SL1S is by far the least shimmery compared to the SL1 and the Mars 3. This way, that's the SL1S. So even though you can still see the LCD's physical resolution in the surface finish, it's actually visibly quite pleasing already without any finishing. Another thing you can also see in both the prints of the SL1 and the SL1S is how well that tilting mechanism works for getting clean peels on each layer change. On the Mars 3, you can see, these random horizontal imperfections, and this has been something that's been visible on every resin printer I've used so far that didn't have the tilting platform. And it appears because sometimes the layer doesn't quite release in the same way as the others, and it creates, this sort of a line. The SL1 and SL1S just don't have these. The SL1S, just like the SL1 and every other Prusa printer, have very good stock profiles in Prusa Slicer, which is free, open source, fully featured, and you can use it with other printers too. And just the same vice versa, there's nothing about the SL1S that prevents you from using other slicers like the Lychee Slicer. They're currently working on getting the SL1S added. Also, the SL1S itself is also open source. And all this is very much unlike some of the other masking LCD resin printers. I really like using Prusa Slicer, particularly because it has so many and such good profiles built in for the Prusa machines. I've never found the need to go profile tweaking in Prusa Slicer except for, of course, changing the actual print settings. The support generation in Prusa Slicer actually turned out to be better than the one in Sheet2Box Pro that I used for the Mars 3. This one. Initially, I was saying that Sheet2Box Pro was producing better supports than Sheet2Box Basic, but I'm not so sure about that anymore. It actually still produced these long, stocky supports that end up not really doing much, and it also completely forgot to support the snake's head on this one. Not what you're thinking right now, the actual snake head animal right here. On the print from the Mars 3, that detail just doesn't exist, and you'd have to manually support that to get it to print right. Now, the resin-specific interface in Prusa Slicer and the features for that aren't that well baked yet. They work perfectly fine, but I find that they're often awkward and confusing to use, until you get used to them. Like, why can't I just type in a value here? How should I know that clicking on the object drills a drain hole? Why is there no preview for support points? It's got its usability quirks, even though on a functional level, it does everything you need. There are a couple more rough spots on the SL1S itself that I need to address. If you've seen the live stream, you'll know that this is a printer that I upgraded myself from the SL1 to the SL1S, but even the original SL1 that this used to be, I built from the kit, which I don't think they even offer anymore. There might be a good reason. Working on the SL1 and the SL1S is not fun. It's a super tightly built printer, and replacing parts like the LED assembly in the bottom with, this is the original one, with one that takes up almost 3 times the space, and then having to awkwardly attach that to the existing mounting points with the printed adapter, it is super finicky. Also, plugging in the new hardware into the existing mainboard uses 2 adapters. One adapts the little Lego style connector to the FPC cable of the new screen, and by screwing down that adapter PCB, you're putting so much pressure on the connector if you just barely over tighten it. That connector is just not made for that. Then this cable down here has a lock-in connector, and because the spot you need to plug it into is just a plain straight pin header, they give you this printed adapter that lets you clip that connector to something. really, it's just an alignment help because it doesn't really lock anything. Like, you can clearly tell that this is an upgrade that the original SL1 was never designed for, and that results in some questionable adaptations of the existing hardware. It works, but I would rather not have to see how it works. Then also, specific to the upgrade, it looks like they'd actually kept the calibration settings from the SL1 stored in firmware, meaning bed offset and sensorless homing sensitivity, which caused some issues during the upgrade livestream. The interface does try to help you with links to help pages when it catches an error, but in this case of the homing triggering too early, that page basically told me to tear the entire printer apart and tighten down the Z-axis assembly somewhere down here where it's attached to the rest of the frame, when in fact it's just 2 taps in the settings menu, which isn't mentioned. The firmware is still one of those spots that could use a bit of polishing. For example, the SL1S still keeps the resin sensor, which makes sure you have enough resin to complete the print, but not so much that it spills over the vat once it tilts. But it seems to be a fairly common problem on the SL1S that it thinks there's too much resin in the tank when, in fact, you aren't even close to the 100% mark. I saw that once, and after simply restarting the print, I never saw it again. But yeah, this is something that could just be solved by, for example, automatically retrying the measurement cycle when it detects that something isn't quite right. Prusa have often already fixed early issues like this in their other printers, and I'm sure it's going to get ironed out too in a future over-the-air update. Yeah, this printer has Wi-Fi and wired Ethernet, so that makes that really easy. So, is the SL1S worth $2,000 by itself, and should you upgrade your SL1? Well, before we answer that, what I noticed is how cheap, comparatively, the upgrade kit is. The upgrade is €400, which is impressive considering that you get a new masking LCD, UV LED, a new print platform, the resin vat, and a new power supply. Which means, is the frame, the main board, the touchscreen, and the Z-axis assembly worth the remaining €1,600 to get a complete SL1S? Not really. I mean, the value you're getting is not just the hardware, it's also part of the R&D cost, continued support with firmware and software updates, and of course the free software itself in the form of Prusa Slicer. And then all of this is open source, which is an additional risk that needs to be factored in. If you just get the upgrade for $400, that is all already covered by a purchase of the original SL1. The Prusa SL1S platform definitely is not cheap, but it is still the platform that I find myself most inclined to use when I need to get a resin print done. It's the most well-made resin printer that I have, and it objectively produces the best prints. It's a good printer at a premium price, which comes with non-subscription software. Now, should you get the upgrade if you already have an SL1? That depends. It's good value considering what you're getting, but unless you need the larger build area or the massively increased print speed, the SL1 is probably still fine. Or you might just want to have a couple of extra resin vats at hand that are now much cheaper in the SL1S because they are an injection molded material, and you can get these for $25. Obviously much cheaper than the old billet milled clinic ones that the SL1 used. But with the upgrade, you are throwing away a lot of perfectly fine parts. So I think a good point to upgrade would be when you've already worn through the original masking LCD of the SL1 and would need to replace that anyway. All right, I hope that gave you a good overview of the new Prusa SL1S Speed. If you're interested in getting one, there are the affiliate links in the description below, or if you want to support the channel in some other way, watching and subscribing is great, but you can also check out YouTube memberships or Patreon, and you can find all the infos on that right below the like button. Thank you for watching, keep on making, and I will see you in the next one.